Hello, OSH310 class. It is wonderful to see you all here today. And I'm excited as this is really the last week of actual content for this class. I know everything's been building up to this, but let's go ahead and get started. And it should be a fairly quick one, but it's important still to pay attention and give some time to the readings as there's quite a bit of it, but I'll hopefully try to simplify it for you for a little bit. So first, what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about different kinds of waste. So we spent a little while talking about wastewater. So that's any sort of waste that is primarily consisting of water. Now we're going to talk about solid waste. And so a lot of this just has to do with like construction waste or chemical waste, industrial waste. Basically anything that is in a solid form that is then, I guess, turned into waste, wanting to be disposed of in some way. The very common way that non-hazardous waste is disposed of is through a municipal landfill. So this is designed for non-hazardous or household waste. So you're not supposed to really put anything in here that could potentially harm the environment or harm someone else. And principally, municipal landfills are typically managed by the state that they're currently located in. And with that, there are some slight variations of the overall design, but they're relatively about the exact same. We can see from this picture down here in the bottom left that what it typically is it goes through a layering system. So first, starting with the very bottom, around the very bottom, there's typically a plastic or a clay liner, and as well as a leach collection system. So as time goes on, as this gets rained on, and as the water passes through this trash, it has the potential of picking up any potential contaminants within that trash and carrying it down into the water table. Well, this clay and as well as this leach collection system is there to be able to help mitigate that or slow it down a little bit, just so that the earth can do its natural recycling process as far as capturing it, just like with liquid waste. And so what it typically does is, again, it's that layering factor. Just as household trash and some construction waste as well, it'll naturally break down over time. It just needs that time. And so you can be able to see that there's a layer of household trash and then an earth layer, so just soil, and then another layer of household trash, another layer of soil, and another layer of household trash. And it just keeps going. It's just this layer of trash, layer of dirt, layer of trash, layer of dirt. This is, again, just to be able to space it out. It allows that decomposition to occur a little bit more rapidly and in a more even manner as well. Then typically it's covered with more dirt or more earth, and typically something such as sand, clay, sand, topsoil. It's just various different regular earth layers that are naturally put there to be able to allow that natural filtration process to occur. Again, a lot of this non-hazardous material, but it's something to slowly be able to help. So some of the biggest things is that, again, it's a designated place to be able to put this household trash or non-hazardous trash and waste material. And one of the biggest benefits to a municipal landfill is, if done correctly, you can actually reuse the land whenever it becomes filled. One great example of that actually is those of you who might be in Idaho at this time, or maybe visit, or have just even seen it. Over here on the right, this is the Idaho Falls Temple. And right next to the Idaho Falls Temple is Freeman Park, and a little ways down the way is Idaho Falls Airport. Well, a very interesting thing is that Freeman Park and the airport, the land, used to be a municipal landfill. That's, again, one of the huge benefits, is a municipal landfill, if it's actually taken care of properly, can be used for a recreation site, can be rebuilt upon, because it does not have that hazardous materials. And it can be something quite beautiful at the end of the day. There's a wonderful talk that's in the readings. I highly encourage you to be able to look at it. It just talks a little bit more about it, and it makes it a little more relevant So it's important whenever we're dealing with solid waste that, similar to other controls of hazards, there is a hierarchy that we typically like to follow. So it follows the same design structure, an upside down pyramid, illustrating what is the most preferred method down to the least preferred method. And that's what that picture right there on the left illustrates. And also I listed them down there on the right as well, just these very same steps. Just know that they go in order that we'll cover. So the waste management hierarchy, specifically for solid waste, first starts with the most preferred method, source reduction and reuse. So a great example of this actually has to do with, have you ever gone to the store and you're getting like a USB stick, something that's literally the size of your thumb, but the plastic around it is about the size of your head? It's a little bit crazy on how much plastic waste there can sometimes be. A great way of being able to mitigate that waste and how much is generated and therefore how much needs to be treated and taken care of is reduce the amount of waste that you, or the amount of materials that you use in the first place. Limiting it down, creating a very small package could be able to help. We're not talking about as far as feasibility. I think loss prevention probably prohibits why they don't do that in the USB example, but it's just the idea to framework it. That's why the most preferred method, just reduce it in the first place. Just try to limit how much waste you're generating anyway. Then moving down the list of preferred, recycling and composting. So next, if you have to generate it, let's see if we can repurpose it into something else, and or compost it so that we can reuse it in a different fashion or in a different way. Then energy recovery. So a great example of this, for example, would be if your company takes old cardboard boxes. For example, they can't be recycled or they can't be reduced or reused in any sort of way. So what your group does is they take them and they burn them to be able to operate a turbine. And burning it, that's a different environmental issue. It's not the best example, but it's then turning that cardboard into a different power source and changing it into an energy recovery system. So we're able to get something back from it. That's the overall premise. Can we use this solid waste to turn it in a different kind of energy and still be able to utilize it? Not the most preferred, but is still a little bit better than the least preferred in the waste management hierarchy, which is treatment and disposal. We're going to go over a lot of this, but a lot of that has to do with turning it into a landfill. Some of it's even just as far as incineration in general, just for the sake of incinerating it, not trying to recover any of that energy, or disposal, such as putting it in a landfill and waiting for it to naturally decay over time. But this is the waste management hierarchy. Again, just focus on as far as what is the most preferred method, what's the least preferred method, and know the steps in between. So next, we talked about non-hazardous waste, so now hazardous waste. So hazardous waste, you can easily define as waste with properties that are hazardous. Is a very intuitive lesson if you can't tell. I'm very glad that I'm here to help walk you through some of these concepts. But hazardous waste, ultimately, there are 4 criteria. It just has to meet one of these criteria to be considered hazardous waste. It could meet all of them. It could just meet 1, it could meet 3. Doesn't matter. At least 1. And that is ignitability, toxicity, corrosivity, and reactivity. These pictures here on the right just further help illustrate it if you're more of a visual learner. But ignitability means that you can use it to create a fire and it'll sustain a fire. It can spontaneously combust or has a flash point of less than 60 degrees Celsius, about 120 or 140 degrees Fahrenheit for us in the States, more familiar with that. Next, toxicity. That is anything that is harmful or possibly even fatal if it's ingested or absorbed into our skin. That's a very wide variety of things. and possibly is one of the most common forms of hazardous waste. Next, corrosivity. You can be able to see in a good example in that top right section of the picture. It's just a liquid that's being either dripped on a hand and it's eating away at the hand, or on a piece of metal and it's eating away at the metal. Doesn't matter if it's a person or a thing. If it's corrosive, it'll eat away at it. That's any strong acid, so that's something with a pH that's less than 2.0, or any very strong base, which is a pH of greater than or equal to 12.5. So it's important, again, understanding every single chemical that we have, or every single really liquid that we have, even like lemon juice, for example, is somewhere within this pH scale that measures, honestly, it's, don't want to get too far into the weeds, how many free hydrogen atoms are present within the compound itself, which then illustrates how it's going to be able to react not only with itself, but other objects within it. For example, lemon juice, again, it is higher acid, so therefore a lower pH, and it has that kind of tart taste to it. That's due to the acidity as well as some of the other factors with it. But this isn't chemistry. We're not going to go too far into it, but just know that corrosivity, it's very low pHs and very high pHs. Then reactivity. So here the picture, it illustrates a bomb. So this is where it's very unstable under normal conditions. So that could mean that it off gases very easily, or it could actually explode. A variety of different things, but basically it wants to turn whatever form it is into something else. And so it's just very unstable at normal, predictable circumstances. So hazardous waste, because if it meets one of those 4 criteria, it needs to be disposed of and treated in a different way than a regular landfill. We can't just bury it and then just leave it alone. We need to take care of it appropriately. There's some specific requirements that are very important, and this picture illustrates it, but let's go over the requirements first. Some of those requirements involve that all the items need to be organized or categorized and stored appropriately. That way you can be able to avoid incompatibility. For example, if you've taken a chemistry class or been around chemistry, one of the biggest things is you don't mix water and acids. It's because if you mix them incorrectly, they're incompatible, and it could cause an even greater chemical reaction between the two. Very similarly, all this hazardous waste, especially with reactivity that could occur, we want to make sure that we're only storing compatibles together. Otherwise, we literally are almost making a bomb. Okay, next, air vents. So you can be able to see in this picture, this is methane removal. It's just it's the black stick that's sticking into it with a pipe leading out of it. You sometimes see these in just regular landfills as well, but they're definitely required in a hazardous waste landfill, because as these things are naturally sitting, they tend to off-gas. They tend to produce some sort of gas or vapor that needs to dissipate in some way. Otherwise, that buildup in a very tight or confined space, also not good. So these air vents are very, very important to be able to help regulate that pressure within it, and then as well help that reduce that incompatibility factor. Next, surface water must be diverted. If there's any surface water that's nearby, it cannot go anywhere near this site. It has to stay away. Just in the off chance that there's potential leaching from this site, we don't want it getting into the water and traveling who knows where down the line. Very similarly, you can see illustrated from this picture, there's another very clear indention made, but then it's typically lined with a heavy-duty clay or sometimes even concrete. It's a very secured area to be able to limit the amount of leaching that might occur. And that's primarily because groundwater has to be monitored throughout this entire time, as well as geotextile lining, that's that concrete, or anything to be able to discourage water potentially leaching into the contaminated water leaching into the groundwater supply. As well as another thing is most hazardous waste sites have to be secured 24/7. You can only imagine if all of these hazardous waste materials could just be picked up by any Joe Schmo. That's not going to be good for the environment or the population or anything at large. And one of the biggest factors, again, that's alternative to a sanitary or a municipal landfill, is that you can't build anything on top of it. Once you're there, it's there. Sometimes you can build a more solid treatment facility, but again, it's for the hazardous waste disposal. You can't build a park on it. You can't reuse that land really for anything. All right, so I wanted to take a little bit of time as well. I want to move this because I think this picture is really interesting. I'm not going to go too far into it, but in the readings, there is an 11-minute video. It's either 5 minutes or 11 minutes, talking about the Love Canal. So this is up near Niagara Falls or Niagara in New York. Definitely look at it. It's a quick, interesting video, though. I guarantee you'll learn something at the end of it. But the biggest thing is that this was actually one of the largest environmental tragedies in American history. It's huge. This is a landmark case, mostly because it illustrated very early on the dangers of hazardous chemical waste. So, Love Canal, hazardous chemical waste. Definitely go check out that video. It'll be well spent. It really will. So this picture I thought was a very interesting one. I hadn't seen it before until I was researching this, but it just illustrates there's a little kid wearing a cardboard box that says, "Please help me." It'll make a lot more sense once you watch the video. It's actually really sad. But there's a sign that he's standing next to saying, "Love Canal Recipe. 1, mix 82 chemicals. 2, place in canal for 25 years. The yield, sickness and death," or unalive if you're part of that group. And it really is a tragedy, and especially we can reflect on some of the other environmental disasters that we've even had recently. For example, with the train derailment that happened just earlier. But definitely environmental disaster, but this one we're going to be focused on Love Canal. Watch that video. Yeah. All right. So next, we are cooking through it and we're burning through it. I want to respect your time and let's just keep on going. Next, we're going to talk about the waste or hazardous waste manifest system. So the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA, created a system to be able to track the transportation of hazardous waste. There's hazardous waste traveling all the time. You probably look out your window, at least here in the United States, look out your window. Somewhere within your view, there's probably some sort of hazardous waste being transported. The EPA wants to be able to track from cradle to grave. What cradle to grave means, and this picture illustrates it, that means that whoever generates it all the way to until it's stored or disposed of or treated. The entire time. We need to track it and we need to be very observant as far as where it is and what's going on. That's why the main components of the manifest system is that a manifest or a written document, a physical written document or electronic, I guess now, but a document is created for every single bit of hazardous waste generated. So the generator creates this document, the waste that's given to the transporter, the manifest is given to this transporter, and they maintain it all the way until it reaches this treatment, storage, disposal facility, or TSD, otherwise known as a waste treatment storage facility. That manifest follows that piece of waste throughout its entire life. Even whenever the TSD facility, once it receives it, until that waste is absolutely gone, that manifest stays alive and it stays there. But let's talk about it a little bit more and let's go into each one of these parts. So these, again, the three big key players, really the only three key players whenever it comes to the waste manifest system, are the generator, the transporter, and the TSD facility. Again, TSD stands for treatment, storage, disposal. The generator, their primary responsibilities is they are to evaluate the waste. They're supposed to know exactly what it is, what it reacts with, what are different characteristics, what are incompatibilities. They have to know everything about this waste that they just generated, in addition to what is the exact volume of weight that they need. And they are the ones who create this manifest. And this manifest contains all of this information that's important for this waste disposal. The generator then makes a copy of that manifest and then gives the waste and the copy of that manifest to the transporter. The transporter's job is to follow the Department of Transportation, the DOT. So Department of Transportation, U.S. agency that helps regulate what transporters need to do when transporting hazardous waste. So the transporter, they deliver the waste from the generator to the TSD facility. They maintain the manifest and they ensure that they're not losing any of that hazardous waste. That's why whenever they pick it up, there's a volume of waste that is recorded on that manifest. And then throughout the entire travel until it reaches the TSD facility, you may have seen like weigh stations or things if you've traveled throughout the United States. They're constantly checking it as they go to make sure they're not losing anything. Because they lose something, that's a very bad deal. It's their responsibility right now. This manifest is slowly giving the responsibility of who is in charge of that hazardous waste until it finally gets disposed of. Although the entire responsibility of the hazardous waste is always on the generator. Doesn't matter where it is, it's the generator's fault that that hazardous material is even there in the first place. But once the transporter then arrives at the TSD facility, again, treatment, storage, disposal, he or she makes a copy of the manifest and delivers it to the TSD facility. Now, the TSD facility has a copy of the manifest and now has the hazardous waste. Their primary responsibility: determine the best way that this waste will be disposed of, whether it's stored, treated, or disposed of. We'll go into that in a second. They also maintain that manifest and make sure that they keep a copy of that record until that waste is gone, and most often even past then. And they're in charge of ensuring that they have a secure landfill, just like we talked about before, that they're securing and keeping track of that hazardous waste until it is gone. But those are the key players of the waste manifest system. So now let's go a little bit into the regulations behind it. Who made this decision as far as how hazardous waste is going to be regulated, how it's going to be decided? There are three things, and I apologize right now why they named them almost the exact same thing. Definitely spend some time, try to just say them over again. Those things are RCRA, CERCLA, and SARA. So RCRA, CERCLA, and SARA. These are federal laws that were enacted to govern the waste or govern the disposal of hazardous waste. RCRA, or RCRA, stands for the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. CERCLA stands for the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act of 1980. Definitely focus on that compensation and liability part. That's a key feature of CERCLA and how it differs. Then SARA, which stands for the Superfund Amendments and Reauthorization Act. So now let's go into each one of these. And it's important to be able to understand how each one differs, what they do, and what role they play in the disposal of hazardous waste. So RCRA, remove me, RCRA. So that is ultimately, it gave the EPA authority to control hazardous waste from cradle to grave. It's RCRA that gives us the different key player responsibilities whenever it comes to generator, transporter, and TSD facilities. So all that waste manifest system comes from RCRA. And so it was enacted in 1976. So it's all of these responsibilities have been in place, and it outlines that waste management system, manifest system, and the key players. It gave responsibilities to generators and transporters, and it also outlined what treatment, storage, and disposal facilities do and what their responsibilities were as well. So RCRA is kind of the big tree whenever it comes to the beginning of controlling hazardous waste disposal. Next, we have CERCLA. And again, remember that's Compensation and Liability Act. So this was passed in 1980, so 4 years later after RCRA. And this regulates the cleanup of Superfund sites. Now, if you haven't heard of a Superfund site has to do with how much or how big a generator of hazardous waste is. So for example, in Idaho, I don't believe Idaho National Labs is a Superfund site. However, very close to it, just across the border in Washington, is the Richmond. And so Richmond National Labs, that is a Superfund site. It generated a lot of waste, it contains a lot of waste, and so they're regulated by CERCLA to dispose of that waste generally and properly. So CERCLA, what it did is it established a national priority list. This is a list of all of these Superfund sites throughout the entire United States, and it then ranked them on which ones we need to be able to attack first as far as that cleanup procedure. And it constantly is that tracking mechanism to make sure that they're doing their due diligence and managing their hazardous waste generation, transportation, and disposal appropriately. Currently, there's roughly about 1,300 sites throughout the US. There's a ton of these everywhere, and they vary widely, whether they're a huge one or a really itty bitty small one. But if you're labeled as a Superfund site, CERCLA gives you specific instructions on what you're supposed to do. One of the biggest key factors that CERCLA did that was revolutionary as well is that it issued a tax specifically on petroleum and chemical industries, just because they're some of the biggest and those most notorious hazardous waste generation sites. They are specifically taxed, and therefore CERCLA pushes this liability on them. And as well as some nowadays, it's other companies that release hazardous waste into the environment or generate hazardous waste in any way. It provides again that liability, just showing again who is responsible for this waste. Ultimately, the generator, no matter where it is in that that three-step process, generator, transporter, or TSD facility. It's ultimately the generator's responsibility. So CERCLA, it focused on those Superfund sites. It made the national priority list, and it taxed petroleum and chemical industries so that hazardous waste generators were liable for what they were doing. Next, we have SARA. So kind of a mistake almost was that CERCLA was not permanent. It was actually it was temporary. It wasn't built to be able to keep going and to refund itself in a way. So that is why SARA, again, the Superfund Amendment Act, that's why it was created. It amended CERCLA so that it can keep going and can allow itself to continue to happen and to occur. And so it extended the authorities and responsibilities that CERCLA enacted. So RCRA, again, is really the big landmark case that hazardous waste needs to be treated and it needs to be taken care of appropriately. CERCLA put liability on Superfund sites or those generators so that they were responsible for the hazardous waste that they generated. SARA makes it so that CERCLA keeps improving and keeps requiring it. And it's so that it's basically, in a way, it's kind of like how we reelect a president every 4 years, whether we reelect the same one or elect a new one. SARA is there to make sure that CERCLA keeps on getting elected, keeps on getting pushed through, and that these hazardous waste sites keep on being focused on. It also threw in some important additions. Some important additions is that it increased the size of the Superfund fund. It made it so that there's a lot more money available for the treatment of hazardous waste. It dedicated more federal funds to that. It also increased the amount of parties and elements that were involved with this. It now, instead of being on a federal level, it now is involving the states the states are now helping out with their own Superfund sites that are within their own borders. And so it increased, again, that revenue, and so that these can be treated in a more efficient manner. Same thing, it reauthorized new funding for the Superfund or CERCLA. And then as well, it streamlined hazardous waste regulations. Whenever CERCLA came out, it had some really good principles and it really helped kind of kickstart things, but it wasn't perfect. SARA is a way that it can constantly be redefined and it can be able to further streamline hazardous waste regulation from there on out. So ultimately, that's it. There's you'll notice in the reading there's quite a bit. I'll spend some time, but I try to simplify it down as much as possible to at least some of those keys, nuts, and bolts. Definitely go into the reading. It's really going to help whenever you are just trying to fill in some of the gaps and hopefully kind of branch off from the framework that this provides. I did want to spend a little bit of time, as this is really, again, the last week of actual content for this course. Next week, there's some reflection periods, and that's important. But I did want to be able to just focus on one thing. So the final exam, I know you guys have so much going on just during finals weeks and really everything else. So I wanted to be able to give you a gift. If so, if you want to refer to it as that, or consider that, I guess. With that being said, after the week 13 quiz is due, the next day I've opened up the final exam. So instead of having 2 days, you're going to have an entire week that you can take it. I would advise taking it as soon as possible. Just, again, who knows with internet connectivity, other difficulties that you have. Definitely pay attention to the end of the semester whenever all grades are due. I try to be as lenient as possible and try to really work with you, especially whenever it comes to technical difficulties. But the biggest thing, and the only thing that I can't change, is the final day of the semester. I can't extend anything beyond that. That's out of my control. So try to do this early. That way, if you run into anything, we can work together and we can try to be able to figure it out. And hopefully as well, maybe you could accomplish this and get this done before any other finals, and then you don't have to worry about it and you're done. But something to consider. Same thing, please let me know of any questions or concerns that you have. I'll make sure there's going to be still another weekly announcement for the very last week, but know that it's been a pleasure. Hope that this has been good. Let me know if you have any questions or concerns about the material for this week, and yeah, make it a great week.